I think it's really hard to give like a blanket statement of what people should eat because I do think it is quite personalized, but I think there's some principles that we can all use that can be helpful, which is really focusing on whole foods. Focus on clean foods that came from the earth, that are minimally processed, that are not covered in, pesticides, and that hopefully come from good soil and are filled with nutrients.
Casey Means, how's it going?
Great. How are you, Max?
Thanks for coming out to LA.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
What brings you to town?
I was here for the Recode conference at the Beverly Hilton. So speaking about the future of biowearables, biosensors, and glucose monitoring and metabolic health with Kara Swisher. It was a lot of fun.
I hear you know a thing or two about these topics.
I love these topics. I could talk about them all day.
So talk to me, share your background with me and my audience if you can. Let's start there.
Absolutely. So I'm a medical doctor by training, and I actually trained as a head and neck surgeon. So I did my undergrad in medical school at Stanford and then went up to Oregon to do surgical training. And in ENT, head and neck surgery, I'm treating all of these conditions that are essentially disorders of inflammation. It was like all day long, sinusitis, thyroiditis, laryngitis, all these itises. And itis is the suffix in medicine that means inflammation.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so, I'm throwing steroid prescriptions at everyone. Steroids, tamp down the immune system. And, you also do antibiotics all the time. And then when those things don't work, you take them to the operating room, you bust a hole in their sinus or their ear or whatever, and you suck out pus and you send them on their way. And after a while, I sort of really started stepping back and saying, where is all this inflammation coming from? Like, why don't we talk about what the root cause of this is? Like, inflammation is a sign from the body that there's a threat and that something's going on. What is that threat? And I'd been fortunate to have a bit of a background in functional medicine. I'd been reading, Mark Hyman since I was young and kind of had a sense of some of these things. And that, really in our modern world, a lot of the triggers of inflammation are our diet and lifestyle, as you well know. And a big driver of them is metabolic dysfunction. And so kind of started putting some of these pieces together and looking at some of the physiology of these conditions I was treating day in and day out. And realizing like you can't actually operate on the immune system. Like it doesn't make sense. Like you may operate on the downstream symptoms of a condition, but you're not actually sending that patient away with optimized cellular biology. You're not actually fixing the root cause of the problem. And when you look at some of the top killers in the United States, which are like heart disease, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's, dementia, diabetes, all of these we also know have a lot of inflammation going on with them. And when you sort of create this Venn diagram of like the cytokines or immune mediators that are sort of upregulated in these conditions, the one for all the ENT conditions are kind of the same for all the ones that are these chronic disorders. It's like, interleukin 6 and TNF alpha. And not to get too wonky, but it's like there's clearly something going on that's related to all of these things. Why don't we treat at that level in medicine? Well, because we're in a reactive system that waits until diseases manifest, and then we play whack-a-mole medicine, where unfortunately we treat each condition as if they're totally separate, different things, as if they're isolated silos. And that feeds into the system that we have where we kind of give a different medication for every single condition. And unfortunately, the reality is this doesn't really work. Healthcare costs are going up in our country, $4 trillion now. They're going up every single year, and people are getting sicker, people are getting heavier, people are getting more depressed. It's just not working. And so as a physician, I'm sitting there taking people to the operating room every day. It is a huge thing to operate on someone. Like you're cutting into their body. Like, and then they're coming back for revision surgeries and just thinking I'm not really making the impact that I want on helping people be healthier. I'm certainly sucking the pus out, but I'm not actually making these bodies healthier or doing anything to actually impact the rest of their overall holistic health. So that was sort of my journey towards kind of really stepping away and looking into kind of what the root causes were. And that led me towards the path of really being pretty obsessed with metabolic disease because it's underlying so much of the pathology we're seeing in this country right now. And, metabolic disease, what that really means is that bodies have a problem processing energy in the body. They have a process using it, making it, storing it. And what this, shows up as is, obviously overt diseases of metabolism like diabetes and obesity. But I think what people might not realize is that it's actually underlying so many of the other conditions we're seeing, like we were just talking about cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, even other subtle things that aren't necessarily killers, but are their pain points like erectile dysfunction, infertility, gout, depression, anxiety, et cetera. So we've got to, as doctors, figure out how to fix this and how to help people with this if we're going to actually make a big dent in the chronic disease epidemic that we have in this country. And so started thinking about levers of like, how do we do that? And one of the best ways that we can do that is help people manage their blood sugar, because blood sugar is one of those key parts of our energy processing in the body. And we're just eating, way too much blood sugar. And basically the average American is having trouble processing blood sugar in this country. And that's leading to metabolic disease. Over 50% of Americans have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. It's insane. That number should be close to zero. And more broadly, a recent study in 2018 from UNC showed that 88% of Americans have at least one biomarker of metabolic dysfunction, which means impaired blood sugar, cholesterol, or weight. And so this is clearly one of those elephants in the room that like we have to solve. And as a physician, I just said like, if I'm going to be fulfilled in my career and feel like I'm really doing something meaningful, like this is the issue I have to address. This is underlying so much of the morbidity. I can certainly help people doing ENT procedures, but like I've got to focus my energy on something that really is going to, I think, have a bigger impact. And so that led me towards ultimately creating a functional medicine private practice, moving away from ENT, and then thinking about how to really scale solutions. And so that led me to starting Levels, which is the company that I co-founded and chief medical officer of, which is a company that gives people access to biosensors, continuous glucose monitors. They can actually track their glucose 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and see exactly how food is affecting their body in real time and get a real sense of what their blood sugar is so that they can hopefully know what's going on with their metabolic health, track it over time, figure out how to optimize it, and just stay out of this whole mess of metabolic disease that's just completely plaguing our country.
I love that. I don't want to talk about metabolic health, but let's take a step back before we do that. And can you just define metabolism for the audience? Because I feel like that's a term that people hear a lot these days, along with inflammation. But you're a physician, so what actually, when you say metabolism, what does that mean?
Yeah. So simply put, metabolism is all the chemical and cellular reactions that are happening in the body that produce energy from food. It's how we transform the food that we eat into energy that we can use. And then if we're not using that energy, how we store it. And this is fundamental to all aspects of health, because if you think about it, all we are really is 37 trillion cells. Like that's our entire structure. We of course have trillions of bacterial cells as well, but every single one of those 37 trillion cells in our bodies need energy to function properly. And when cells don't function properly because they're not making the energy they need, depending on which cell type that's happening in, it could look like totally different symptoms. If that's happening in the brain, it could look like dementia, chronic pain, depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia, Alzheimer's, dementia, all conditions associated with poor metabolism. If it's happening in the ovary, it could look like polycystic ovarian syndrome, leading cause of infertility in the US, a metabolic condition. If it's happening in the penis, it could look like erectile dysfunction, which is also a metabolic disease. Metabolic dysfunction causes the blood vessels to narrow, causing problems like that. If it's in the heart, it could look like stroke, et cetera, et cetera. We could literally go through any organ system. And if there's a metabolic problem, meaning the way that a problem with how energy is produced, you can see symptoms showing up. We tend to look at those all as disparate things when in fact, for many of them, one of the key contributing factors is this just core pathway of producing energy being screwed up. And really the reason it's screwed up is because the way we're living in the modern Western world is hijacking our cellular physiology, our core basic pathways of how to produce energy. And the reason that's happening is because one of the factors is food, certainly. And sugar is a big one. We're eating, probably almost like 20 times more sugar than we were eating 100 years ago. The average American, you'll see different statistics, but eating somewhere around 60 to 152 pounds of sugar per year. We should probably be eating less than like 1 pound of sugar per year. So that just like monumental load on the body gums up the system. And then of course, like industrialized seed and vegetable oils, which you talk about a lot, these things cause oxidative stress, which hurts our mitochondria, which are the energy factories of the cell, also create metabolic dysfunction. And then lots of other things in our industrialized food is causing this issue. But then it's other things like it's stress, it's sleep deprivation, high cortisol, it's lack of physical activity, it's micronutrient deficiencies, it's microbiome perturbations, it's exposure to environmental toxins. These all cripple our cellular biology and the way that our cells make energy. And so we're unfortunately facing a situation where we have just this like energy problem in the vast majority of bodies in the United States, and it's showing up as dozens of symptoms because when cells can't make energy, they're dysfunctional. When cells are dysfunctional, tissues are dysfunctional. When tissues are dysfunctional, organs are dysfunctional, and that's what symptoms and disease is. We really have to start looking at it in that way. And so that's really simply what metabolism is. It's how we produce energy, and it's fundamental to every single cell in the body, and we want it to work properly.
And I think it's so great that you guys are setting out to tackle this from the standpoint of diet and nutrition, because that's definitely one of the more impactful factors. I mean, of course, you mentioned our activity levels, sleep plays a role, the microbiome. It's almost in a way like I would describe it as energy toxicity. We're just like we're eating too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And the energy toxicity thing is really interesting because we have too much sort of energy in terms of calories coming into the body, but we're not using it properly because we're disrupting our mitochondria's ability to process it. And so a lot of it's being stored. And that's why you're seeing so much in the way of the overweight and obesity epidemic, with 74% of Americans dealing with overweight or obesity. It's astronomical. And this is downstream of this cellular problem that we have so much power to improve, and we can improve it rapidly in our own lives. But it does take, awareness to this and really being vigilant. Like if you're an American today, more likely than not, you're going to be chronically ill by the time you're an adult. That's really sad. And also, if you just go on the normal treadmill of just like American culture, you will get sick. That's almost a guarantee. If you just do whatever is the norms, sitting, eating packaged foods, which make up 70% of our calories these days, kind of letting your phone beep in the middle of the night so you're getting poor sleep, like you're going to get sick. And so you really have to do something differently these days if you want to escape that. And the beauty is like, it's fairly simple. And it's, but you do have to be vigilant and you have to be aware. And that's where I think education, like what you and many others are doing in the nutrition space and the wellness space, but also potentially things like monitors, which is really why I'm excited about Levels, is that it gives people the data in their own hands. And so you get to move past these systems that I think in many ways are kind of manipulating people, like the food industry, which is literally designing food to take you to your bliss point. Like it's designed to make you just feel like you're desperate for it, to like induce leptin resistance so that you're actually hungrier, like to cause these blood sugar spikes and crashes, which actually make you crave more. Like we know how the brain works. Like these foods make us dependent on them. And so to have some data that serves as agency and some recourse in the face of monumental challenges we're facing today to be healthy is really cool. Because like an example is, and this isn't even like necessarily like a junk food, but I was eating oatmeal frequently for breakfast because, of course, doctors tell you that you should eat oatmeal to be healthy and for your cholesterol. And the box literally says heart healthy on it. Like, this is a great source of whole grains. So I eat, one little package of instant oats. And was actually for this particular experiment, I ate 2 packages of instant oats with nothing on them, no sugar, no berries, no nothing. Blood sugar went up 80 points. I never want my blood sugar to go 80 points. I usually after a meal, I want it to go up maybe 20 or 30 glucose points, but usually not above 110 milligrams per deciliter. I went up to about 170. So we know that big glucose spikes like that, which is called glycemic variability, that directly is actually an independent predictor of future risk of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and stroke. Your body does not like these big blood sugar spikes, no matter what people tell you about, like, oh, well, in a normal, healthy person, these don't matter. That's not true. Glycemic variability is an independent predictor of future, downstream problems. So for me, in my body, in one breakfast, I can say, this is not heart healthy. This is not something I should be eating if I want long-term cardiovascular health. And this is just not a good food for me, at least in that permutation. Certainly there's ways to kind of hack oatmeal. You can eat steel cut oats or groats and add fat, fiber, and protein and blah, blah, blah. But like that is not heart healthy. So through that, I have agency. I've cut through food marketing. I've had agency in the face of a healthcare system that is giving me really generic advice, unfortunately, because doctors are not trained in nutrition. I think the average doctor has really good intentions, but the reality is that the healthcare system profits off people who are sick. And that's kind of built into the system. And we get paid to, take care of sick people. And so none of it's aligned or incentivized with my optimal thriving and health. And by having the data myself, I'm able to make small micro decisions like that are actually allowing me to make choices that are right for my body.
Yeah, so true. What are the potential harms though that can come from a transient and acute blood sugar quote unquote spike? I mean, if you're eating a banana or a I don't know what's something that I eat that has, or a piece of like gluten-free sourdough bread, and maybe you've had a workout like earlier in the day and you have a transient excursion in your blood glucose levels. What are the risks to come from that?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that the body is extremely resilient. And so one-time things I'm not too worried about. And no one should freak out over a single glucose spike. This is really, we're talking about trends over time.
Got it.
And the body being affected over time. However, there are things that can happen acutely. And there's 4 main things about a glucose spike that I think are well established in the literature that are worth being aware of. So a glucose spike, a high one, is going to cause a few downstream things. One is it can cause glycation of things in the body. Glycation is sugar sticking to things like fat, protein, DNA, whatever, and proteins. And that sugar sticking to molecules, which sometimes is called like rusting of the body, leads to dysfunction in those things. So you don't want glycation. And when blood sugar is high, it's going to stick to more stuff. The second is oxidative stress. So the generation of free radicals in the body, these reactive molecules that can cause damage to parts of the cell. And the third is inflammation. A lot of blood sugar in the body, in the bloodstream really quickly says to the body that something's different, something's off, something's a little weird, and that can generate some acute inflammation. And the fourth, which is the one that will like affect you and that you can kind of notice, is reactive hypoglycemia. So basically when you have, you eat a bunch of carbohydrates, it's going to be transformed into your bloodstream into glucose. Your body's then going to release insulin from the pancreas, as you know, which will let you take that glucose into your cells for use or for storage. But when the glucose spike is high, your body really will send out a big insulin surge. And sometimes it can overshoot and basically suck up tons of glucose really quickly into your cells and lead to a dip, actually lower glucose levels than before your meal. And that little phase is called reactive hypoglycemia. And often that can be associated with anxiety, mood lability, fatigue, maybe some brain fog, and cravings for sure. And so a lot of what I'm thinking about when I'm eating is how do I avoid reactive hypoglycemia? And how you can avoid it is by keeping things much more like gentle rolling hills in your glucose, never having that huge insulin surge. You're just kind of like staying around a safe sort of median level during the day. I think glucose variability like often translates into variability in my actual day subjectively, whether it's mood, energy, athletic performance, brain sharpness. And so for me, one of the best life hacks of my life has been just figuring out how to keep glucose more stable so that my days feel just more stable. So those are the 4 kind of acute things. The bigger picture thing that you want to think about with those glucose spikes is how it's actually ultimately leading you down the spectrum of metabolic disease. Because as I said, one glucose spike isn't going to do it. But if you're doing that 5 times a day, day after day, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, that is causing problems that are going to lead you down that road of metabolic disease. And the way that happens is that those repeated insulin spikes from the glucose, the cells are having to respond to all that insulin. And ultimately, they're going to say, this is too much. We can't force more glucose into these cells. And the cells become numb to insulin, which is called insulin resistance. And they actually block that signal. And the body responds by producing more insulin to overcompensate. So now you've got insulin levels going up in the body to try and sort of force more glucose in. And this is essentially, this insulin resistance is the process towards type 2 diabetes and all the other associated conditions. For people who are worried about weight or trying to lose weight, this is directly related to that because that insulin, that hormone has many, many effects. One is to get the glucose into the cells, but it's also a signal to the body to not burn fat. Because what it's saying to the body is we have tons of glucose around for energy, and our 2 main energy sources in the body are glucose and fat. And so when that insulin's high, it's saying, we don't need to burn fat. We've got tons of glucose, stop burning fat. And so for anyone who's on a weight loss journey, those repeated glucose spikes are just directly working against you, essentially. So those are the main reasons why we want to keep it more flat and stable.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we definitely consume too many carbohydrates. I think the average American today consumes about, 300 grams of carbs a day? And clearly, like, the best way to reduce the glucose like area under the curve in our bodies is to just eat less of it. But my concern then is like, how do we, get this message out there without pathologizing like healthy sources of carbohydrates, right? Like the big bowl of berries, which we know are great for our brains, or I don't know, what are some great, sweet potatoes, things like that. I mean, these are not dangerous foods, right? So my question to you is then, like, for somebody who's wearing a continuous glucose monitor, who then goes and eats like a bowl of berries or a sweet potato, and they see their blood sugar spike, like, how do we like allay their fears and let them know that this is actually like, okay to eat? I don't even want to use the language once in a while. I mean, you can have a sweet potato every day if you want, right? Like, that's not going to be, you've got bigger fish to fry if that's what you're concerned about.
Totally. It's a great point. And I think the answer is it's about nuanced education. And that's why with Levels, like, we're a small company still, but like a good portion of our team is all our education team and our content team, because honestly, it is complex to kind of work through these things. And I think you mentioned the bigger fish to fry. I think big picture, one of the bigger fish to fry with having access to these monitors is for the person who's not necessarily making these micro optimizations, like, should I eat raspberries or blackberries? But
That's
like,
me.
right, it's the people who are drinking 2 cans of soda a day and who are eating really sweet breakfast because they actually think that that's okay. Like, that cereal is an okay thing to eat for breakfast, which it's not. Or it's fine to eat, but it's not going to align with optimal health.
It's not optimal. Yeah.
Everything's okay depending on what your goals are. But, and so it's, those are the things where it's just like, oh my God, I actually thought this was okay. Or like, but it's being able to see the data. It's just amazing how seeing the data, feeling what you're feeling in your body. So the subjective response, like, I don't feel great, I feel tired, seeing that aligned with a spike, and then knowing what you ate, that sort of trifecta of like choice, data, and subjective feeling, I think is really the essence of behavior change. And so that's really like for the larger population and the bigger sort of population in the US, who's eating a lot of ultra processed foods, like, that's what I think this is going to bring to their lives. Now, to actually answer your question though, with berries and sweet potatoes, so I'm of the camp that, like, if it's a whole food that's unrefined, it's a good thing for your body. Like, our body knows how to deal with whole foods, and if we're primarily eating those, we're going to do well. Now, there are ways to even eat certain whole foods in a way that is actually, I think, more optimal for the body. So, for instance, if you're eating the berries, you can find many ways to mitigate a glucose spike by eating the berries with additional fiber, fat, or protein to not have such a glycemic excursion. And I actually think that is probably better for the body. So what that might look like is some, like, whole milk yogurt, or, full fat, cashew, non-dairy, unsweetened yogurt with some chia seeds and flax seeds on top, and the berries. And so that might actually, if you, let's say we're going to have a 50-point glucose spike with a pint of blueberries, it might be a 10-point glucose spike if you have it with some of these other foods, especially the fiber. I've noticed that to be one of the biggest things. So I'm now adding like chia seeds and flax to almost everything. And with the sweet potatoes as well, I had a cup of sweet potatoes. I've done a lot of experiments with the continuous glucose monitor on, and actually sweet potatoes caused a huge spike for me, like probably around 60 or 70 points. It was just 1 cup of baked sweet potato. Like, that was it, nothing on it. And that's a lot. I actually I would not probably eat them by themselves because it is causing a large glycemic excursion. But when I eat sweet potatoes a few things. If I eat sweet potatoes with, again, like fiber on them, so like adding a bunch of other vegetables, maybe adding like a sort of whole food fat dressing, like a tahini or, something like that.
Yum.
And take a walk afterwards for 20 minutes. Or, we know with resistant starches, if you take the sweet potato, cool it in the fridge, and then reheat it, it'll actually likely cause less of a glucose response, because when you cool the sweet potato, it changes the carbohydrate structure so that it creates resistant starch and is less digestible. You could also eat protein and vegetables before you eat the sweet potato, which we know that if you eat protein or like roughage, they've studied, like, if you have a salad before a high carb meal, it actually has less of a glucose response. So like salad, chicken, or whatever before the sweet potato, maybe gonna have a lower glucose response. So there's like a dozen things you can do around the sweet potato to actually get all the beautiful nutrients that has, the beta carotenes and all that stuff, and have less of a glycemic excursion. And so that's getting really like nuanced and nitty gritty, but I think it's a cool way to kind of design your meal such that you're getting all the beautiful stuff from the food, but with less of the collateral. the
Yeah.
collateral damage.
Yeah. I like that. I mean, you know, if I'm, I wonder what would be, because like if I'm about to eat a bowl of berries, which have a certain sort of like caloric value, like would I then want to add like a tablespoon of fat or whatever to the berries and then just be adding like, you know, empty calories from fat?
Mm. Well, it depends on how you respond to it.
Yeah.
So, like, the really interesting thing about glucose is that everyone responds differently to
Right.
the same food. So, you and I could eat the exact same bowl of berries and have totally different responses. And this has been studied in some really interesting research over the past 5 years. There was this great study from the journal Cell from 5 years ago called Personalized Nutrition by Prediction of Glycemic Responses.
Was that the microbiome study?
It was. Microbiome plus they found 137 factors. Like that was the big headline was the microbiome, but they in their algorithm they actually put in like over 100 things that were related to why people responded differently. But the take home from the paper was that you can give 800 non-diabetic, quote unquote, like healthy people the same standardized meals, and what we would expect based on what we thought, which is that each food has an inherent property to raise glucose, that everyone respond exactly the same. And that's kind of how the glycemic index chart works is like, oh, if you eat a piece of white bread, it has this glycemic index, so it's going to raise your blood sugar this much. And they found the opposite. They found that people reacted completely across a huge spectrum to the same food. So you like people were eating the exact same standardized cookie and some people would go up none and some people would go up 80 points. And it was just absolutely fascinating. And one of the big factors that they saw as predictive of how they would respond was microbiome composition. So that's one thing with the berries. Like maybe you don't spike to berries, which is great. But I know that I actually do spike to several of the like low glycemic berries, like a pint of blueberries or something. So for me, it may be that I add them to like the fatty, like the yogurt and add some fiber. It might just be that I decide to not do that because I don't want more empty calories, like you said. And I just take a 15-minute walk afterwards, which has a massive impact on how you respond to it. Or maybe I do them right after my high intensity interval training workout when my muscles are like super primed to be insulin sensitive and to take up glucose. So there's like all these different ways to approach it. But I do think overall, the more we can keep our glucose flat and stable, the better for long-term health. That doesn't necessarily mean we always have to add, you know, fat and protein to every carb we eat, but there's other adjuncts like the, you know, like the walking and exercising, making sure we're eating our higher carb meals after a good night's sleep and not when we're sleep deprived, because our glucose responses are always going to be higher. And our insulin responses if we eat them after a really poor night's sleep. So there's just these sort of ancillary things that you can do to think about the context with which that meal is coming into your body to minimize that metabolic response.
I think it's fascinating that you become essentially pre-diabetic on just one night of bad sleep. Because I wore the Levels CGM for 2 weeks and I sleep pretty well. I wasn't, you know, I don't think I recall having like a night of bad sleep during that period, but that would be fascinating to measure and see.
Yeah.
Is that what your data is showing you as well?
I mean, for me, we haven't necessarily seen it on the large scale. We haven't done that analysis yet, but for me personally, there's no question. Like it's just a frame shift up my whole day if I'm on a couple poor nights of sleep or if I'm traveling, especially. And we just recently did a study with Whoop where we actually saw that people's recovery score and their metabolic score seem to correlate. And recovery score is largely driven by like how your sleep quality was. And so that's not surprising to me at all. But like if I'm on really poor sleep and I know my glucose is going to be basically 10 points higher like all day, I tend to do a little bit more of a keto day, you know? And if I'm like exercising and doing Peloton and slept for 8 hours, like, sure, I'm more insulin sensitive that day. There's no question. And I can probably tolerate a little bit more carbs.
One of the most fascinating things I learned when I was wearing the Levels was that your blood sugar can spike for reasons other than what you've just consumed. I was sitting in my brother's infrared sauna. Shout out to Clearlight saunas. And I was shocked to see that my blood sugar, actually, there was a pretty significant spike from that. And I posted that on my Instagram. And of course, you know, I got a lot of people asking me questions like, so does that mean saunas are bad for you? But walk us through that. Like, how does that work? How would sitting in a sauna cause your blood sugar to spike?
Yeah. So there's two reasons. One, which is less fun of an answer, which is that it may have been sensor error because heat actually really does impact the sensor quite a bit. They're pretty temperature sensitive. But it's also possible that it was your physiologic response. And that was likely stress mediated. So heat and cold are both acute stressors for the body. And the body has this really interesting hormonal response where basically under times of stress, whether it's that sort of what we would consider positive hormetic stress, like a sauna, or kind of chronic, low grade, not good stress, like just like psychological, living the modern life of like emails and honking and low sleep. So any type of stress, though, releases catecholamine hormones and cortisol in the body. And this actually goes to the liver and signals to the liver to break down its stored glucose. The liver stores like a few hours worth of glucose in chains called glycogen. And it's kind of like our debit account, like our short-term savings account for energy. The long-term account being the fat stores and the short-term being the liver.
That's the savings account.
The savings account, exactly. And so those hormones tell the liver, break it down. The body's stressed. We're having something going on, and we need glucose to fuel, the muscles and the brain right now. And so it can be like a rapid response where, let's say you're giving a talk at work and you're stressed out. Like 5 minutes into it, you might start seeing your glucose go up. It's really amazing how quick it is. That may be what's happening in the sauna. We've certainly seen that with people in ice baths who we know it's not sensor error because they've actually kept their arm with the sensor on it outside of the bath and they see a spike. And then the other time we see this reaction happening is when people are doing really high intensity interval training workouts where usually they have to be above about 80% VO2 max or roughly 80% max heart rate. That is a stressor, an acute stressor for the body. Again, probably like a hormetic kind of good stressor, adaptive stressor, but it will make your glucose go up. So if you're kind of doing a light jog or a walk, glucose will usually stay stable or go down. But once you go up to that above 80% VO2 max, it sends the stress signal to the body. And so often during like CrossFit workouts, Peloton workouts, you'll see you can see a 20, 30, 40, some people see like a 60-point rise in their glucose. That one, while it is stress mediated, I would not consider a bad glucose response. And the reason for that is because unlike the other stressors like psychological stress or chronic stress, with the workout, you're activating your muscles to take all that glucose up and your muscles are becoming more insulin sensitive during that workout. And something really cool about muscle as a tissue is it actually doesn't require insulin it has an insulin independent way of taking up glucose. Just the contraction itself will soak up glucose. So you're dumping this glucose from the liver, but there's a sink for it. It's taking it in. And we know that those workouts just acutely make you more insulin sensitive. So overall, a workout spike is not something to worry about. It's like a different physiologic sort of process. But the stress spikes, I think those are really good feedback because we don't want to be that's where you're basically releasing glucose, but there's not a sink for it. You're not running from a lion. You're not actually using your muscles. So that glucose is just sitting in the bloodstream and your body is going to need to generate insulin to take that up. That's not good. And especially in our stressful modern lives, if that's happening multiple times a day, day after day, that's not a positive thing. So, so that's sort of some of the thinking behind the
So that's fascinating. So for people that go to their doctors and they get their annual, physicals and they see that their blood sugar, either their fasting blood sugar is elevated or their A1C is higher than they would like it to be, that could be purely from stress, right? Chronic stress.
I think it's a huge contributor. Yeah. I mean, there are people who are on perfect dialed in diets, really low carb, whole foods, healthy fats. And if you're still chronically stressed and not really dealing with the stress well, you can see metabolic issues.
Fascinating.
So that's a key lever. I'd say food is, in my opinion, always going to be the top thing on this sort of what are the areas we can intervene on. But sleep, stress, and movement are both right there. And they kind of all need to be dialed in for optimal metabolic health. And if you're seeing your numbers not where you want them to be and you feel like your diet is just perfect, I'd really be thinking about the sleep, the stress management, and how can we fit more movement in throughout the day and not just one big workout a day, but how can we really move throughout the day? Walk for 2 or 3 minutes every hour. It's not just about the one workout a day. The research has actually shown that the people with the best glucose levels are the ones who move consistently throughout the day. So those are just definitely ones to think about if people are plateaued.
So important. I try to get 10,000 steps a day and I fail miserably most days because I live in LA. You're always in your car. It's such a big problem. But I feel so much better on the days that I'm that I'm able to get close to that goal. Or when I'm traveling, in other cities, it's a lot easier to walk. I'm from New York City, which is where,
New York.
yeah, I mean, New York is like the place. You could easily do like 20,000 steps in a day in New York
without trying.
And it's just like, yeah, just like getting to and from work or something. Talk about labs and like how physicians typically diagnose metabolic illness. Like what are some of the features that you would see, on a lab that would make you think, oh, this patient is metabolically unwell?
Yeah. So in terms of the standard lab tests that you're going to hear about when you go into the doctor's office, the three ways that we diagnose like frank prediabetes or diabetes in this country are fasting glucose, an oral glucose tolerance test, and hemoglobin A1C. Those are the three tests approved by the American Diabetes Association to tell us about where we fall on this spectrum. And with fasting glucose, if your fasting glucose is under 100, you're considered normal or non-diabetic. If you're between 100 and 125, you're considered pre-diabetic, and 125 or above 125 is considered type 2 diabetes. With the oral glucose tolerance test, it has its own ranges. And then for hemoglobin A1C, which is basically a marker of how much sugar has been sticking to your red blood cells, it's more of a marker of like a 3-month average of your blood sugars. That's done in a percentage of your hemoglobin in the red blood cells that's been glycated or have sugar stuck to it. And if you're below 5.7%, you're considered non-diabetic, 5.7 to 6.4 pre-diabetic, and about 6.5 or above type 2 diabetes. So these tests are kind of really blunt instruments in terms of understanding. And unfortunately, the problem with these tests is that they miss so much sort of pre-disease. They miss telling people that they are creeping up on the spectrum of a problem and that their cellular physiology is problematic it waits way too long. And so there was a fascinating paper in The Lancet, which is a premier medical journal from a couple of years ago, that basically showed that once your fasting glucose has gone into the range where someone would tell you have a problem, you've probably had insulin resistance for over 13 years beforehand. But unfortunately, we don't test for insulin resistance in standard medical practice. And a lot of doctors would think you're crazy if you're like, I want to test insulin levels, I want to test insulin sensitivity. There are tests to do those things. So a lot of more progressive doctors, like in the functional medicine space and the longevity space, it's like, fasting insulin is one of the first tests they'll do because that is going to rise far before your fasting glucose. The reason for that is because that insulin is rising to compensate, to keep that glucose down until the system kind of gets too far out of whack and then it can't compensate anymore and the glucose starts rising. But you can imagine like the body can compensate for a long time before that happens. So the interesting thing about fasting glucose is that we bucket people into this under 100 as normal or healthy category, which is really like an unfortunate fallacy to tell people that if you are not at 100 yet, you're totally fine. What the research has actually shown is that as you move up in the normal range of fasting glucose, you have a much higher risk for downstream problems, which is not surprising. But that's not the way we approach it. If you're in that bucket, you're fine. If there's not a red flag on the chart that your doctor's seeing, I would say most of the time the doctor's going to say, yeah, everything looks good, which is not true. If you're up at 97, 98, 99, you are far down that spectrum of insulin resistance and metabolic disease. It's not like something magical changes when you flip over 100 into like 100 and 101.
Right.
Probably things have been going on for years and there's a huge opportunity to get to right the ship, and it's very possible to just move right back into a healthy range. And so when you look at the research, it's actually probably more optimal to be between 72 and 85 for your fasting glucose, not up in the 85 to 100 range. So I'd love to see, more research showing the long-term outcomes of sort of the differences with the normal range so that we can give people more of an optimal range to shoot for, as opposed to just this bucket of, you're not in the quote unquote prediabetes phase yet. We really need to be looking at things more as like, where on the spectrum are you, not which bucket are you in? Because the body doesn't work in buckets. We are like this complex physiologic process. And, it's not like a light switch goes on and all of a sudden we have a problem tomorrow when today we were fine. The really cool thing about lab tests is that we can actually suss out where we are on the metabolic spectrum by looking at our cholesterol panel and kind of like discerning some clues from that. If your doctor's not willing to order a fasting insulin test, you can look at your cholesterol panel and get a general sense of what's going on with your insulin sensitivity, which is cool.
Well, why wouldn't a doctor be okay with that? Is it not covered by insurance or what?
It's not covered by insurance for most people, and it's just not part of our standard guidelines for how we
Interesting.
diagnose these things. And I think this again comes back to our really reactive medical system and, the efficiency of the medical system. We've had to do like glucose is like cheap and easy to measure from a public health standpoint. It literally takes 1 drop of blood to measure fasting glucose. It's very simple. And so it's become the standard. And we have learned, and really it is a downstream lagging indicator of a physiology problem.
Right.
We're not actually testing for the physiology problem. We're testing for the downstream result of that problem. And I think part of that is that we may not have necessarily, known sort of the physiology when we were sort of figuring out what these public health tests were going to be. And so medicine takes a long time to catch up with the research. It can take up to 20 years for something that was published in the research to make it into clinical practice. And I think we're in that awkward in between right now where we realize insulin is really the problem, but we're not testing it yet. But through conversations like this and research that's happening, I think we'll get there. The other sad thing about healthcare is that oftentimes the things we test are based on the things that we can actually treat. So we have medications to bring glucose down. We don't necessarily have medications that like directly impact insulin sensitivity. We do have some like metformin, but when we have medications that really very clearly kind of can track that marker like glucose, we tend to favor those. So but overall, if you're listening, like ask your doctor for a fasting insulin test. You want it to be low, like ideally definitely under 10. A lot of people say under 8 or under 5 for sort of optimal insulin sensitivity. But on the cholesterol panel, some really important things to look at are the triglycerides, because triglycerides are kind of a general marker of what's happening with carbohydrate processing in our body. Typically, people will say they should be under 150. I know a lot of doctors who want them to be under 100, some say under 70. And so if triglycerides are riding above 150, like that's really something to dig into. And, if you're seeing triglycerides a little high, fasting glucose a little high, that's a signal, like there may be something going on. The other thing that's a really important ratio that you can calculate is triglyceride to HDL ratio. HDL is like what we'd consider our good cholesterol. And we want HDL to be high and triglycerides to be low. So we want that ratio to be quite low. Like some people say potentially like 1. So basically your triglycerides and your HDL being the same, which would be very, very hard to achieve.
Wow.
Because you can imagine then you'd have like, if your HDL was 70, which is high, and triglycerides were really low at 70, the ratio would be 1. That would be very, very hard to accomplish. Some doctors will say less than 4. So essentially 4-to-1 ratio between triglycerides and HDL. I think that's too high. Some will say that it varies by race. So I believe Robert Lustig, who wrote Metabolical, I'd have to double check this, but I think he says like 2.5 or 3.5 based on whether you're Caucasian or of African-American descent, but we can maybe link to that. But the general take-home point is that we want that triglyceride to HDL ratio to be low because that seems to be a great surrogate marker for insulin sensitivity. So that's getting kind of into the weeds, but I would just say people should focus on take the cholesterol panel you got last year that's on your, online portal. Take a look at your triglycerides, take a look at your triglyceride to HDL ratio, and, see where things are standing and maybe, bring it up with your doctor.
Yeah. What about LDL? That's a contentious topic in the online nutrition space. Some say that it doesn't matter at all. Some say that it's still the most important causal player in cardiovascular disease. What's your position? Yeah,
I mean, I think what we're learning is that probably one of the most important things with relation to LDL is the particle size of the LDLs in our body. So LDL is not just one thing. There's actually different types of particles that make up that total LDL number. And some of the important ones we talk about are small density LDL and large density LDL, with large density LDL being likely safer and less promoting of cardiovascular disease, and small density LDL, which you can think of like little pellets, like are actually much more dangerous. They lodge into the blood vessel walls, they cause inflammation and the hardening of the arteries that we think about with heart disease. So we want more large density, less small density. And what's interesting is that triglyceride to HDL ratio that I was just talking about may actually be somewhat predictive of where you skew on the small density to high LDL compared to large density LDL, where if that ratio is lower, it's likely that your favoring that large density, safer pattern of LDLs. So
Also referred to as pattern A.
pattern A and pattern B,
Yeah.
right? So you want those fluffy, big particles, basically. And so while the LDL number, if it's really, really high, you know, I think above like 200 or so, you know, you want to start thinking about like what's going on for sure. But the first thing I would do is figure out what the particle size are. So that would be asking your doctor for a what's called advanced lipid testing or NMR lipid test, which will break down the LDL into the particle sizes and give you a sense of what your risk is. But what we know is that a low sugar diet and a low carbohydrate diet will bring that small density LDL down. It is likely the sugar and the insulin that is driving that small density pattern. And so very different than what we've kind of been taught with like, it's all about fat and cholesterol and this and that. It's likely the insulin and the sugar that's driving the dangerous pattern.
Fat also plays a role, though, like the types of fats that your diet is composed of primarily. Like saturated fats, we know reduce the amount of LDL receptors on the liver, on the surface of the liver, which can help, which obviously are important in terms of sucking back up those LDL particles before they have the opportunity to become small and dense.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for, especially for people who are genetically prone to dyslipidemia, like just being a little bit more conscious of like the fat composition of their diets.
Absolutely. And there's certainly genetic factors as well with this, where certain genetic phenotypes are going to respond worse to saturated fat in terms of how it's affecting their overall cholesterol levels. And so that's sort of a much deeper conversation. But I think kind of big picture, we probably need to be thinking deeper about LDL and what it means. And I'd like to see everyone, you know, getting essentially a particle size test in the future, because I think it just helps us give a little bit more understanding of what's going on inside our bodies. And certainly also on the fat conversation, like the seed oil, the industrial seed oils and vegetable oils and these kind of crappy oils that we're eating in like massive quantities these days, these directly also lead to insulin resistance. They lead to problems with our mitochondria, oxidative stress that can generate the insulin resistance. So, you know, that's another thing that we really want to get out of our diet to sort of promote our overall metabolic health and the cholesterol levels we want to see.
Yeah, I mean, seed oils are the worst. Just the processing of them. It's so intensive, you know? And we don't have like the long-term data, like what it's like for a human being to be consuming such high amounts of these kinds of oils over the course of a lifespan, because they've only been in the modern food supply for what, like 40 years at this point?
Yeah. I think if anyone wants
Probably
to
more
be
than
super
that.
horrified.
50, 60 years
Yeah.
probably. But something, you know, to that degree, like we just don't know the effect and the processing. It's like a horror show. You guys can go to YouTube. There's like, you can watch canola oil being made.
That was exactly what I was just going to say.
It's disgusting.
It's the worst of it. It's like a horror film,
Yeah.
basically. It's really bad. It'll make you never want to eat canola oil again.
So I know that, you know, you're obviously co-founder Levels, all about personalized nutrition. But what are some like sort of general guidelines that you can give for people in terms of how to compose and think about their dietary pattern? I mean, is it like low carb diets for everybody, keto diets for everybody? Like what's the recommendation? Like where's the starting place? And then where can people go from there in terms of, you know, catering their diets to their own individuality, their activity levels, performance needs, and so forth?
Yeah. So I think it's really hard to give like a blanket statement of what people should eat, because I do think it is quite personalized. But I think there's some principles that we can all use that can be helpful, which is really focusing on whole foods. You know, focus on clean foods that came from the earth, that are minimally processed, that are not covered in, you know, pesticides, and that hopefully come from good soil and are filled with nutrients. Like that's number one. Like
That's asking a lot, Casey.
I know. But that's like, if we can create like that being a primary, you know, source, like really clean meats, you know, clean proteins, clean plants, you're going to be 90% of the way there. Moving further than that, like, so that's what to put in. And then it's like what to take out. I mean, I would say the more we can minimize or eliminate the refined sugar, refined carbohydrates, and refined seed oils, like, again, that's going to take us a lot of the way there. And in terms of, you know, other things that I think are quite valuable for the body, like in my opinion, fiber is a really, you know, helpful thing for the human gut and for blood sugar control. So really, whole unprocessed foods, avoiding the ultra refined products that are in so many of our foods, and really supporting our microbiome with fiber and tons of healthy phytonutrients is kind of like the base of how I think, and where I think a lot of people in the nutrition space have kind of landed. I mean, people can quibble about like how much meat to eat and this and that, but I think like really clean foods that are as minimally processed as possible is the key to getting a lot of the way there. Um, then in terms of refining, I think you can kind of take any dietary pattern. And so just to get back to your question, should everyone be keto? Should everyone be low carb? I don't necessarily feel that way. I'm not necessarily low carb or keto. I eat mostly, a plant's diet with some fish and eggs. But the cool thing about monitoring is that you can actually take any dietary pattern that you do and optimize it. Like when I used to be fully plant-based, and I put on a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, and realized that so many of the things that I thought were quite healthy were causing super big glucose spikes for me. The
Wow.
grains and, I wasn't eating a lot of processed foods, but like a lot of the grains were causing huge glucose spikes for me, and the oatmeal and stuff like that. And so I got rid of some of those, found some grains like millet that, are sort of grain-like things like millet that worked for me, cauliflower rice, broccoli rice. I can have all the same foods that I love, but I just use those alternatives. So finding out those like swaps that work for me, and then within like sort of just plants in general, figuring out which vegetables and which fruits cause the least glucose response. Like fortunately, there's lots of different varieties of these things. So pick the ones that actually work best for you. So that's sort of like optimizing sort of more of a plant-based diet, which again, I've sort of added in some animal products at this point. But if you're keto, it can also be really helpful for optimizing. There's a lot of keto people who are following like a super strict regimented keto diet and like, no, never touching like a bean and like never touching a carrot and never touching fruit because they think they need to really like, do none of that to stay in ketogenesis. Then they put a CGM on and they actually figure out they can liberalize their diet.
Wow.
They can add in the carrots. They can add in like a little bit of berries or maybe apple with almond butter or whatnot. And we've seen that a lot with the keto community, like actually loosening up a little because they realize they don't spike their glucose and it doesn't kick them out of ketogenesis because they're testing their ketones as well. And like everything's smooth sailing. Then there's people who, maybe don't do really well on a super hardcore ketogenic diet, but they don't do well with a ton of meat or whatnot. They know they do a little bit better with carbs. They still want to generate ketones for health purposes. And then they can actually dial in like fasting to basically buffer a little bit of a higher carb diet, but still be in ketogenesis, and being able to monitor that on a CGM like is really interesting. But yeah, same with, paleo, really any type of strategy that people have, like you can create little micro optimizations to get whatever benefit you get from that diet, how it aligns with your value system, but not have necessarily collateral damage of glucose spikes. So that's what I love about it. It's really diet agnostic and allows anyone to kind of refine what works for them.
We talked a lot about like the downside to having frequent and prolonged glucose spikes, but are there any benefits to occasionally spiking your glucose? I mean, to thyroid function, to leptin levels. I mean, is there any reason why we might occasionally want to have a big carb rich meal?
Yeah. So the answer to this, like kind of, we look to sort of traditional cultures and animals as well, because there is a reason that, animals right before they hibernate eat a ton of fructose rich foods and ripe fruits and berries and things like that before they go and hibernate. It's because they literally want to store fat because they're not going to be eating for months at a time. So there are, and in certain indigenous, like traditional cultures or indigenous cultures, where it's a little bit more of like feast or famine, being able to like eat a lot of fructose, really drive forward some of those fat storage pathways, and then have that ability to have sort of energy stores, that can be a positive thing. In our modern world, in the Western world, that's not, we're sort of unfortunately have taken those evolutionary pathways that allow us to store energy in our body for times of need, and we've just like hijacked them, and we've given way too much substrate to those pathways, and now we're dealing with the ramifications of that. But I would say for people, if there are people who are looking to kind of like store energy. Like a glucose spike and a lot of fructose in the body are going to drive some of those fat storage pathways. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a good thing for the average modern American, but there is a very real evolutionary benefit of why we have glucose spikes and why that spikes insulin and why that leads to fat storage. And there's actually an amazing book coming out in a few months that I was able to review, which is called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, which is all about why it's evolutionarily advantageous for these pathways to work the way they do, but how our modern world is essentially, unfortunately, taking advantage of those. But in terms of just like general health benefits for having a glucose spike, there's none that I can really think of. I would say again, like the one spike here and there, like your body's designed to respond to it. It's not going to cause long-term damage. So no one should freak out about a single glucose spike. It's really more the patterns over time.
I mean, I'm totally on the same page in terms of my own diet. I definitely eat a lower carb diet, although I definitely will enjoy, whole fruit. I've been going to town lately on like pineapple, because I discovered tahini, which is like this Mexican spice it's like a lime and salty, just amazing thing that you can sprinkle on watermelon, pineapple, mango. It's almost better than sex. It's the best thing ever. My question is, that was a bit of I went to the Bahamas there, but my question is, so for people that like, is there a danger to demonizing blood sugar spikes for perhaps a certain population that might then avoid carbohydrates completely and then suffer health consequences from that? Like, there are a lot of women that follow me that don't really do as well on super low carb diets. So I wonder if we run the risk of pathologizing carbohydrates and then sending the message that low carb diets are optimal, and then making a whole lot of people feel like miserable for it. And then also, of course, there's been some pushback from, communities like eating disorder, people with disordered eating and stuff like that. So I just want to address those two demographics, or for anybody else for whom, we want to make sure aren't suddenly becoming like scared of incorporating carbs into their life.
Yeah, it's such an important point. And the reality is like these are things we think about all the time as we're designing the product, because it is nuanced. And I think people are often shocked when they hear that like the co-founder of this company is like a primarily plant-based person, because they're like, wait, that's a lot of carbs. Like why, how does that align? And it's like we were just talking about, like, you can absolutely make that work for a flat, pretty stable glucose response. It just takes a little bit of trial and error and kind of figuring out what foods actually work for your body. So I think the reality is that this does not need to drive people to like a keto or a super low carb diet. I think it will promote the idea that eating foods with refined carbs and refined sugar are leading to problems on the glucose monitor. And I do hope that they will help people avoid those foods, because people don't really need to eat those. But a lot of foods with carbohydrates that have a good balance of fiber in them, like root vegetables and beans and legumes, like don't cause a glucose spike. And so I don't see this necessarily driving people away from those. And again, it's very variable person to person. But I, for instance, do not have a glucose spike of more than 10 points with beans, lentils, and several fruits, like fairly unripe pears, apples, things like that. So, so the monitor in a sense, like doesn't necessarily drive people to totally avoiding carbs.
So I think we kind of need to like uncouple this notion that carbohydrates cause glucose spikes. It's like certain carbohydrates for certain people
exactly
cause glucose spikes. And it's not just carbohydrates, or even food for that matter, that can lead to glucose spikes. Yeah. I think that's an amazing take home.
Yeah, I like to say like a carb in the mouth is not glucose in the bloodstream. Like it's there's a whole lot that happens between a carbohydrate that goes in your mouth and what shows up in your bloodstream, like trillions of bacteria interacting with it, and like a lot of complex physiology. So that is something that I think is important to remember. And but I think in terms of the refined stuff, which will most likely cause a glucose spike in most people, that is cool to be aware of, and like to realize like that's not serving my goals. And maybe I can find a healthier, more whole foods alternative for that doesn't spike my glucose. But the question about eating disorders, like I think that's a really, really important one. And Peter T has a great episode on this, his AMA, about continuous glucose monitors, because he's used them in patients for a long time. And he basically says he actually does not prescribe them to anyone who has a history of an eating disorder, because it can cause this sort of like fixation that, I haven't seen this actually happen in my own practice or with levels, but theoretically, I can imagine it could cause one more thing to kind of fixate on and really, be harmful in that sense. What I will say is that we've seen actually more of the opposite of that, which is that people who have been focused on nutrition and finding the perfect diet and following every nutrition, book and influencer, and hasn't really been able to find the perfect diet for them or reach their health goals, that can be kind of an obsession. That's like kind of the orthorexia that people talk about, where it's like this obsession with wellness. And some of people who have sort of self-reported that that's what they've kind of been like 20 years of being obsessed with nutrition, put on a continuous glucose monitor, and in like a month, they figure out, oh, these foods work for me, and these foods don't seem to work for me. These combinations work for me, and walking after meals for 20 minutes really works for me. And then all of a sudden, it's like, poof, like I don't have to think about this as much anymore. I've actually, as opposed to taking everyone's advice and reading everything possible and trying to just like muddle through all this information, I've figured out these 10 new things that work well for me. That can actually be quite liberating. And I would say, for me personally, I think a lot less about food now than I did previously before wearing this. And the reason for that is because I sort of have in my mind the algorithm of what works and, and what keeps my glucose stable. So in terms of things like weight or whatever, like it's not a mystery. Like I know what's going to, serve the goals and what's not. And so there's two sides to the coin. One, which can be, I think, freeing and create efficiency in our nutrition journey, and one that can unfortunately kind of lead to a bit more focus and obsession on it. And so we have to just be really careful about, I think, spreading that message, sharing that information, and making sure that the product itself, the software that create, really tries to guide people towards a really healthy experience with the food.
And I think it does. I mean, as I've said, I used Levels and I really enjoyed that 2-week period that I was using it for. I think what you're talking about really speaks to the fact that all new technologies really have an aspect to them that's like a double-edged sword. It's just like fire. Fire can either cook your food or it can burn you. So I think it's about establishing a healthy relationship with these things. But at the end of the day, I love this notion of the quantified self, right? Like what you can measure, you can manage and thus improve. And the more data, the better.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, we are a black box, and it's really hard to control something that you don't understand. And unfortunately, the labs we get, the single time point measurements, make it very difficult to actually have understanding, because they're not a story. They're just a snapshot. Stories help us with understanding, and continuous variables like glucose creates a narrative and a story out of what's happening. And that allows us to have more understanding of our own bodies, be able to see within a little bit and make better decisions. And so that's what I'm hoping for people. And really the core mission of Levels is to help people understand how food's affecting their body and to empower individuals with their own information so they can make better decisions and have agency. And especially in the face of a lot of industries that, really want us to eat their packaged processed foods and really benefit off us, being sick and dependent on the system. I am really eager to empower people with their own information so that they can make their own independent, better decisions.
I love it. And I love the word that you keep using, agency. I think it's a really great word. Agency over one's health, I think, is something that, people just don't feel this sense of agency. They feel like they're disempowered. They feel like they're victims. But really all it takes is a little bit of knowledge and to really turn that sentiment around. So grateful for what you guys are doing. What about like biohacker bro, like that puts on a level CGM, and they eat an apple, they see their blood sugar spike. They eat a piece of bacon, doesn't spike. They're like, okay, bacon's got to be better for me than the apple. Like, would that be a misunderstanding of the data, a misconstruing of the data from that?
Yeah, that is a situation that frankly, it's a fear, I have, that people are going to look at this and just say, oh my God, I'm in it. Cause if you think about it, you could literally drink a gallon of canola oil and your glucose won't spike.
Right.
And so is that the new optimal diet?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a very interesting question. Are glucose spikes? So, glucose spikes we know we're not the end all be all metric arbiter measure of a food's healthiness, but just going back to the person who doesn't fully understand the implications of what this data is telling them, they'll eat a delicious Honeycrisp apple. And I'm not making a qualitative judgment against bacon. I love bacon, but is that kind of like a switch that that you might endorse based on the data to come from a CGM?
Well, there's two things here that I think are important. The first is that this is why education is such a key part of our program. We talk a lot about like the goal is not necessarily to like rig the game, like to win the game by just having a flat and stable glucose line. The goal, like winning the game, is having a body that is metabolically healthy and that has like the cellular machinery that processes energy effectively. And so while minimizing glucose spikes is a part of that, it's not like at all costs type of thing. So we educate tons like in our app about the microbiome and about micronutrients and about environmental toxins and about oxidative stress and all these things so that people can understand the full picture of these things. Like, sure, that was a flat glucose spike because you chugged the canola oil, but like there's, the oxidative stress is going to, over the long term, damage the mitochondria and lead to metabolic dysfunction in the long run. It's the same with like micronutrients. Like you need all these little tiny like vitamins and minerals, manganese and magnesium and zinc and vitamin C. Like they literally serve as lock and key cofactors for the proteins that process glucose in our cells. It's so cool. But you might not necessarily realize on the glucose monitor, like I need to be optimizing for micronutrients because you don't see it show up immediately. It's
Right.
over the weeks and months and years that it matters. And so that's an education piece. But the second cool thing is that like, this is where the future of biosensors is going. The future of biosensors is going to be multi-molecule biosensors. Right now, the only molecule we can measure on the body is glucose. It's the only one that exists. Like to actually, you have a sensor on your body and it's giving you that data. And it's a great step forward, but like diet is not just about glucose. It's about all these other things. And so multi-molecule sensors, which are certainly right around the corner, are going to be able to kind of disambiguate some of these things that we're talking about. So let's say you do eat the canola oil, maybe it doesn't show up on the glucose, test, but what if we had that test for oxidative stress? What if we had the test for cytokines that are showing our acute inflammatory or stress response? What if we had some sort of molecule that we could test that shows like about leaky gut or like, something in that realm? Then you could start to say, okay, it didn't spike my glucose, but it caused all these other problems. Like an example of this is that fructose, like straight fructose, which is causing huge amounts of problems in America, primarily hurting our livers because fructose drives fatty liver disease and makes our livers insulin resistant through like a glucose independent pathway. Fructose doesn't actually stimulate. It will not increase glucose or insulin on your glucose monitor. Now, almost all the foods we eat with fructose also have glucose in them. Like high fructose corn syrup is usually like half glucose, so you will see a glucose spike, but fructose itself isolated will not spike glucose or insulin. So you could potentially be eating straight fructose, going down the pathway of metabolic dysfunction, and it wouldn't show up on a CGM. But
it'll jack your triglycerides.
You could check your triglycerides, or uric acid is actually downstream of fructose. As fructose gets processed in its pathway in the cell, it generates uric acid, which is actually something we can measure on a finger prick now or in a lab, not continuous yet. But you can imagine if you had a uric acid monitor along with your glucose monitor on the same little sensor, you'd be able to now see, disambiguate sort of like those types of foods. And so that's where I really see things going, where you have a dashboard where it's like, okay, this food had this type of impact on my body. And it's not just about glucose. So that's what I'm really excited to see. And I think what levels will emerge as is really the software layer to put that type of stuff together. But I think we're going to see some really exciting stuff in the next 2 to 5 years with multi-molecule sensors that help essentially answer that question about bacon and the apple. Like, maybe the bacon didn't cause a glucose spike, but maybe it caused your free fatty acids to go to like a really unhealthy level or something like that.
Yeah. Oh my God. I'm just like thinking about just drinking canola oil and it makes me queasy. It's so gross. And just to underscore what you said earlier in the episode, which I think is so important, it's that metabolic dysfunction, it's blood sugar specifically, fasting blood sugar. It's a lagging indicator of what could be 13 years, you said,
Yeah.
of just doing things wrong.
Yeah.
Eating the wrong diet, living the wrong way. And at that point, I mean, think about all the damage that potentially has already been done on your organs, but also on your skin, on your brain,
Blood vessels.
blood vessels.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we gotta start catching these things early. And I think it's gonna really got to get doctors on board with like thinking this way from like that pre-disease root cause approach and not just focused on like, feeling like success criteria is diagnosing and treating. Like that's not success criteria in treating. Success criteria is preventing and reversing. And we've got to shift gears for more doctors to be focusing that way.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one.
I was born and raised in a very multi-ethnic neighborhood in Washington, D.C. called Mount Pleasant. And it was a lot of Eritrean, Ethiopian, Guatemalan, Honduran, Salvadorian peoples, as well as the Black population. And food was just so important to all of these cultures, partially just because it represented so much of who they were and their identity that they brought with them into this new country. And so food always had this gravity around it. But also this sense of exploration. I mean, there are literally the little bodegas which service their needs, which were like mind-blowingly amazing. For a kid, you could go to the Safeway, that was 10 miles down the road from us, or you could go to the little bodega, which had goat meat and carambola and all these heady spices and all this stuff. And I realized early on that food is a means to introduce cultures to each other, but also to literally import every corner of the world onto our plates. And it was that sense of exploration and connectivity that early on seeded what became my career in kitchens, and lived and worked all over the world. I worked for Jose Andres running his flagship in DC for a little while. And he was the one that taught me a chef is more than the sum of ingredients we put on our plates. And I got just interested in those ingredients and the people behind them. And sustainable seafood became my preferred ingredient, just because, damn, it's the most interesting ingredient in terms of narrative and seasonality and regionality and history. And, it's America's first heirloom food, heritage food. And that just bloomed my career, and worked in restaurants, owned and operated my own, and then left restaurants to become an explorer for National Geographic because, duh, if you get offered that job, take it. It's as sexy of a job as you can imagine it being. And my role was to go out into the world and look at how we can reduce our impact on marine systems through food. But what I quickly realized was that sustainability is not always about reducing our impact on ecosystems so much as it's equally, if not more so, about maximizing the impact ecosystems have on us. And that the end result of sustainability is the endurance of thriving humans, who are wholly dependent upon resilient ecosystems, of course. And that led me to where I am today, really, which is that idea of a storyteller, the translator, the connector. I take health and environment and food and culture and corporate interest and just kind of help it all make sense, because we're all after the same thing in the end, which is thriving humans. And the work manifests itself in many ways, including being here today with you.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that that humanity plays such a large role in your work and the preservation of human health, which I think is so important. And it's apropos that we're talking about seafood, because seafood, there's lots of disagreement in the world that I come from, which is the world of like nutrition and health. And, is red meat good for us? Is it bad for us? Are eggs healthy, or are they akin to smoking a pack of cigarettes, eating an egg? So you hear all this stuff, and there's all this back and forth in the nutrition space, but there seems to be at least some semblance of agreement over fish, and that fish seems to be at least from a health standpoint, very benevolent. People who consume fish habitually and seafood generally have better health. They have better cardiovascular health. They have better brain health. The consumption of fish, 1 to 2 servings a week, is associated even in people that are genetically predisposed to developing Alzheimer's disease, associated with a robust risk reduction. So there's there are all these benefits seemingly to consuming fish and seafood. But of course, we have to do it mindfully of the fact that we are a part of this, right, this ecosystem. And so one of the things that has come up today, I'm sure for you as it has for me, is that there's a lot of confusion now about how to consume fish sustainably, ethically. There was a documentary that came out recently called Seaspiracy. Many people have asked me about it. I haven't really talked about it, in part because I'm not an expert in sustainable seafood. But I know that a film like that is really, the agenda there is to create an emotional narrative. And if you look at the sort of the body of work of the filmmakers, I mean, they've done a number of different vegan agenda documentaries. So I want to have you on to share your insight and your knowledge with my listeners about how to eat fish and how to reap all of the benefits of fish consumption and do it in a way that's ethical and sustainable.
Cool.
Yeah.
Topics I like. Yeah.
So have people been blowing you up on social media about this documentary?
Yeah, to an extent. But there's also, it also seems that it sort of hit a bit of an echo chamber in a way. And just to put it out there, I'm not going to sit here and argue the facts and figures that are presented in that. But I will, I think, put out the initial platform that there is a lot of truth in that movie. There are a lot of absolutely horrific, inhumane, just terrible things presented in that movie, which are true. What I don't agree with that movie is how that is then used as a catalyst to get to this actionable thing of do not eat seafood and sort of this broad brushstroke painted guilty of an entire ingredient category that is in fact one of the most important ingredient categories we have, and its impact on the human existence is far outweighs the volume of calories that it provides for us. And if you look at some of the studies going back just about human neurological development and looking at omega-3s and access to seafood being one of those principal catalytic moments in our evolution, you said that fish is generally kind of accepted as this healthful food, and not just because it's never been painted guilty, of being the devil like butter is, but then it's not, but then salt is, but then it's not, on and on. Bottom line is that seafood is so important to so many people. 1 in 12 people on this planet, their livelihoods are wholly dependent upon fisheries or aquaculture, though it makes up 2% of our global caloric intake. 1 in 12 people are fully dependent upon the ocean. So when we talk about fishing, you can't talk about seafood just as this thing that's over there to be, that's malleable and debatable. I mean, it's up for discussion, yes, but the importance of it is so much larger than just the thing on your plate. And that's what the movie completely avoided. And I think did an incredible disservice and injustice to, which is the larger conversation about how do we relate to ecosystems and to health and to each other through our moral consumption. And the bottom line is you can't just look at seafood in a vacuum either. Is this seafood sustainable or not? Should we eat seafood or not? Well, what about a center of the plate protein? What about animal protein at large? Because that's how we use it. Certainly, I think to most of your audience, that's going to be the case with sort of the Western Americanized diet. And if we look at seafood in that sense, it's like, well, damn, we should be eating more of it, because from greenhouse gas emissions, land use alterations, feed conversion ratio, fresh water usage, antibiotic usage, across all 5 of those incredibly important metrics, seafood has a fan up in the sustainability game against any other animal protein. Why? Because of physiology. You and me, we're fighting gravity and spending a lot of energy to keep our blood warm, and big bones to fight atmospheric pressure, and connective tissue that's 14% of our body. And fish, no, dude, that's cool. I float. There's just these physiological, biological efficiencies. They're there. So, let's just sort of paint this critique of the movie at once, but also sort of reset the parameters of what I think it should have been addressing.
Yeah, so well said. I'm sure there are some listeners who have not yet seen the film. I certainly haven't promoted it because, to me, even calling it a documentary, I'm using air quotes. It's a work of narrative. There is some truth. I completely agree with you, but it is largely as a whole, it's a work of narrative, a narrative fiction. But that being said, I think one of the good things that the film does is that it exposes some of these terrible things that are happening. So for people that haven't seen the film, and I'm not asking you to recount exactly what the film portrays, but like, what are some of the downsides? What's some, like, if you can describe the shadow of the fishing industry for us, and like what we're trying to change, basically.
Well, that's a really great way of framing that, and thanks for that opportunity. So the filmmaker starts off with sort of recounting his love of the oceans, which is deep and authentic and moving, and sort of getting blindsided by pollution, of just that very physical, emotional affront to what we all love about the oceans, which is their vastness, their pristineness, their purity, their otherness. And then all of a sudden to see it marred by damn plastic bags, that is is a stab to the heart. And sort of the journey from there went to, okay, well, what are the stressors that are leading to this? And plastic pollution leads to fishing, because fishing is a major pollutant of the oceans largely through discarded fishing gear. And so sort of the narrative arc of this film jumps from this initial authentic emotional sort of injury to sort of a series of gotcha moments using truths, from plastic pollution from fishing to dolphin slaughter and whale hunting to human slavery that's found in some areas in fishing. And yes, this stuff exists, and we should all be beyond outraged by it. And unfortunately, the solution, sort of the narrative arc, takes some debunked science, takes journalism, faux journalism, and then uses quotes out of context to paint that advocacy picture rather than the incredibly complex truth of it, which is, yeah, seafood's tough. It's the most traded global food commodity, more than double corn and soy combined. It comes to us from every corner of the planet, a lot of it from freshwater. No community is not connected to a fishery or in some way, shape, or form. So it has all of the pulsing, bleeding, crazy, evolving nature of humanity itself intertwined in it. Of course, it's going to be complex. And of course, there's going to be terrible things, but then there's also going to be good. And there's going to be the examples of how we're getting it right, and of evolving industries, and of tackling effectively these very negative specters. I wouldn't say specters, realities. So, like you said, I think it was a great exercise in sort of opening eyes to what's at stake, without actually saying that we have to have this, which is not just my opinion, it's the UN's opinion. We have to have seafood. 1 in 12 people on this planet are wholly dependent upon seafood for their livelihood. And there's different stories too between subsistence communities and those of us, such as yourself and I, who have the power of choice in our diets. So it is important to say that too.
Yeah, I mean, just one example of where the film fudged the truth. It makes the statement that the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is about 50% of the trash and the plastic in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch might come from fisheries, right? But when you zoom out on a global scale, only 10% comes from fishing of garbage in the oceans, and about 80% of ocean pollution comes from land-based resources. So, but what it did was it took a figure from the Great Pacific Garbage Patches, which is just one small part of the ocean, and extrapolated out to the global scale. And it's just, again, presenting figures out of context for the audience. I think it's a massive disservice, and it also undermines consumer impact, right? If you're saying that all of the pollution in the ocean, or nearly all of it, or a significant proportion of it is due to fishing, then what about like the plastic straws and single-use plastic and water bottles and plastic grocery bags and things like that? Are those less important? So I think I would agree that it puts the focus in the wrong place.
Except for the fact that you and I are discussing this right now, and thousands of people are listening to it and care about it. And so to that extent, congratulations. The film has done a good service. And
yeah, that is a good point. Yeah. That the fact that we're having this conversation. So when it comes to eating fish, what do you look for when purchasing? Are you do you preferentially shop for wild? Do you look, is farmed okay in certain circumstances? Like what goes through your mind when you're at the supermarket buying fish for your family?
I buy a lot of fish. We eat a lot of fish in this house. It's kind of our thing, kind of what I'm known for. So the first thing I look for is what's the store? Because sustainable seafood is such a complex diet. It is the most wickedly complex food system there is. Because there's thousands of species that come from different waters and caught by different means, all result in a different sustainability profile of the actual piece of fish on your plate. But damn it, that cod looks exactly like this cod, except this one is wholly unsustainable. Whoa. And even I, who have dedicated my career to this and understanding the science and the programmatic aspects of it, I am very content to just support the retailers who I know are doing it right. And at this point, 90% of American grocery stores have a pretty good to really good, very rigorous sustainability policy in place.
Wow.
And I'm talking about Walmart. They've got a really great sustainability policy in place. And say what you want about Walmart. I'm not, that's not a blanket judgment on the quality of the company, but bottom line is a lot of the seafood in American grocery stores you can trust. And when you start looking at groups like Albertsons, the parent company of Safeway, when you look at Wegmans on the East Coast here, you look at Whole Foods, you look at H-E-B down in Texas, these are the people that have really driven the change in the seafood industry that has been radical over the last 2 decades. And the bottom line is you can walk into those stores and just know that everything in that case has been validated to some extent, enough to the point where I trust it. So basically, the first thing that Americans need to do is to get rid of seafood is the only food I know of that's considered guilty before proven innocent. It's like, well, it's got Fukushima radiation or methyl mercury, or it's not sustainable. Is it fresh? I heard it was raised in a toilet. Just like, oh my Lord. By the time you actually get to, I'll buy some seafood. Like, no, you went and bought the chicken 10 minutes ago. So just the point of getting Americans to the seafood counter with the idea that seafood, it's what's for dinner, is so important. So my broad blanket statement of what I look for is a store that I can trust. And that information is available. I mean, stores are now competing on sustainability, and they take pride in their sustainable seafood. Why? Because everything in the case has been validated. It used to be the case that, well, we're working on it. And if we say that product A is sustainable, but we haven't gotten to product B yet, what does that say about, it was a very much of a CYA, cover your ass sort of approach. Like McDonald's, they've been serving sustainable, Marine Stewardship Council sustainable Alaskan pollock for almost 2 decades now. And They didn't advertise it until about 8 years ago. Why? Because they didn't want to call attention or be associated with this, because it opened up another box of questions. So Yeah, I got off track. But that notion that stores are beginning to compete on this and really advertise their virtues behind their fish is the first thing I'd look for.
I love that. Is there, in terms of like labeling, like when I buy beef, for example, admittedly, I know much more about beef and land agriculture than I do fishing. I know next to nothing about. I think the term that you've used, restorative seafood. But when I'm buying beef, I look for 100% grass fed. I look for humane certified, maybe. Possibly organic. Like these are all kind of like buzzwords to some degree, but they're, I look for them when I'm buying, particularly the 100% grass-fed, grass-finished. Are there any kinds of certifications or anything like that? Maybe watchdog organizations that have a seal, the pluses or minuses of those. Anything in that regard?
Sure. There's a lot of great information out there, and it's evolved over time to make sense of this incredibly complex ecosystem of information. First and foremost, you have the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch program, which I think most people, I think maybe in this audience would be familiar with. These are the wallet guides that were for years back when people carried wallets. I don't know if you remember that. Now it's all an app, and it requires a lot of information input to know where the fish has come from, what species it is exactly, how it was caught, in order to sort of winnow down the information to a green, yellow, red stop sign type principle. But the certifications that are out there, and Monterey is not Seafood Watch is not a certification, it's a ranking program. But the certifications that are out there for wild fish, Marine Stewardship Council, also known as MSC, a little blue check on products that carry that certification. And that goes all the way back through the supply chain. So all the way back to the boat, human rights, worker rights, processing, et cetera, and also chain of custody. So that anything that has that blue check on it has been valid. The entire, chain of custody has been verified. Aquaculture Stewardship Council is another one, the sort of sister organization to Marine Stewardship Council. So wild fish, farm fish. BAP, Best Aquaculture Practice, is another great one that I very much like. And then aside from that, there are appellations that speak volumes. So if you see the word Alaska on it, you're good. You're good. They are the leader in sustainability, so much so to the point where they have set the global example.
Wow.
Sustainability of management and resources written into the state constitution.
Wow.
And there have been examples of failures up there that have been responded to immediately with the right regimen of management. And so, you want to see a system fail so that you can see how the system responds to failure. And bottom line is they just do it right. And that is also true of basically anything caught or farm raised domestically. If it's got USA on it, go for it. And I'm not going to say that everything caught or farmed here is sustainable, but I will say that everything caught or farmed here is managed under the highest and best sustainable program there is. And if I believe in the system, I have to believe in the products of the system and to support them. And I'm not just saying that out of patriotism or nepotism. I live here on the coast of Maine. I could hit a lobster boat right now with a baseball. It's not just about that. We really do get it right. And if you want to invest in the solution, participate in it. Boycotts are very, very effective in terms of setting the example for others to follow, as the US largely has.
Yeah, I love that. Wow. Talk to me about wild versus farmed. In the health and wellness world, wild has this halo effect. And admittedly, I talk about how, from a health standpoint, wild seems to be much, much better typically than farmed. But even I've had some of my assumptions challenged recently, in part by our mutual friend, Eric, but also, from a sustainability standpoint, from a health standpoint. I know that there are examples of fish farms that are doing things better than they had perhaps been done in the past. Places like Norway, I've heard, are really kind of leading the charge, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? The difference between farmed and wild, and when to buy either.
Yeah. This is a question I spend a lot of time with. On the surface, it seems a not benign, but a relatively simple question that ultimately, very quickly, once you scratch the surface of this conversation, gets down into what the culture of innovating and introducing a brand new food system. The last time we got to do that was 10,000 years ago, when we planted the seeds of modern civilization with agriculture, and of course we've revolutionized it several times since. But aquaculture as a global industry, as a means to feed the masses, is only 50 years old. Wow. The first salmon net pen farm, sort of the if you will, the poster entity of farming, is 55 years old. I mean, cars were unsafe at any speed, and a computer the size of a pentagon couldn't do what my iPhone does, without me even touching it in my back pocket by accident. Industries evolve and advance, and aquaculture is an incredibly complex one. It's the process of creating ecosystems in which to keep animals, very complex living systems, alive. Yeah, man, they made some mistakes. Yeah, there were some people that pursued it for the wrong motivations, meaning profit first and only. But bottom line is, it's also incredibly exciting that we are witnessing the birth of a food system. We are witnessing the paving of humans' next great engagement with our planet, which is to creating space for ourselves in the oceans, not just acting on them, but acting within them. And so aquaculture, what's better, farmed or wild, quickly gets back to this conversation of like, well, what's the human relationship with the ocean? But bottom line is, farmed and wild from good sources should be considered as equally important parts of the human diet. Not all forms of aquaculture belong in all places, or not all aquaculture products belong on everyone's diet. But bottom line is, when it comes down to just categorically, is seafood good for us? Should we be pursuing more of it in our diets as part of a plant-based diet? The answer is yes. Just yes. Then you get into nitty-gritty of all the different species, all of the different, health nuances, say between all of the different salmons, et cetera. And those can be argued down to a molecular level. The value of that debate, when it comes down to just choices for dinner, I'm not going to weigh in on, but is it a clean, lean protein that provides an excellent source of a lot of essential vitamins, nutrients, minerals? A lot of seafood provides omega-3s. Is it more environmentally sustainable than other land animal proteins that we eat a lot of, 250 pounds per person per year of? The answer to all of those questions is yes. And so there you go.
Yeah.
Big answer.
I love that. Dude, I'm so glad that we're getting to have this conversation. Is there a difference when it comes to sustainability? Like, is farmed going to be better for the environment, worse for the environment than wild? Because the question that always comes up when talking about wild, or when I promote the consumption of wild fish, is that we're overfishing. Are we overfishing? As the documentary Seaspiracy claims, are our oceans going to be fishless by the year 2048?
Yes, we are overfishing, but we are also managing the vast majority of our fisheries sustainably. Seaspiracy claims this now debunked term that the oceans are going to be devoid of marine life by 2048. That was a 2006 paper written by a scientist by the name of Dr. Boris Worm out of Dalhousie University up in Canada. Excuse me. And he himself debunked his own paper 3 years later in 2009, a paper written with Dr. Ray Hilborn from University of Washington, in which, no, the oceans are not going to be devoid of life by 2048. Could we do that if we tried to? Absolutely, we could. But bottom line is we have good management structures in place. And there are areas of the ocean that are being terribly abused, that we need more oversight and regimen to manage. But the oceans are 70% of this planet's surface. Fisheries happen everywhere, much of them outside of the jurisdiction of any nation state. So finding the economic policing mechanisms to prevent unsustainable seafood from getting into the marketplace is complex. But about 65% of all of the globe's fisheries, wild fisheries here, are managed or are executed in a sustainable way. And that accounts for about 78% of the fish that we eat is coming from sustainable sources. So 65% of fisheries doesn't necessarily mean that's the number of individual sort of economies, but each of those economies produces different volumes. So you can have almost 78% of seafood that we eat from the wild is coming from sustainable sources. So that fact and figure right there is like, wow, well, when does humanity get anything 78% right? That's a pretty great grade. That tends to get overshadowed by that, we're overfishing. Well, yes, that's true, but the larger context is far more positive.
So who's supporting, which cohort of consumers is currently supporting overfishing? Is it like buying fish from really weird random places? Is it third world countries? Is it like who's supporting that overfishing? If you're saying most of the supermarkets are now, when we go to most supermarkets in the United States, we're very likely buying sustainably farmed fish. So who's supporting the overfishing? Where's that fish going to?
A huge amount of fisheries volume runs through Asia, and this is. Just to be clear, I am not blaming the world's problems on one region by any means, but that is the nucleus or sort of the epicenter of seafood economies and fishing efforts. And also just geography. There's a lot of ocean over there and a lot of different nation states and a lot of different interests competing for very closely interrelated resources. So it's very complex, as opposed to, say, American fisheries, which are, okay, we're pretty much alone over here. We got Canada and we got Mexico in this, kind of hemisphere of our own. Cool. It's a lot easier just mathematically to manage what's happening, in our exclusive economic sense. So another problem is that some of those unsustainable fisheries are fisheries that you and I are not participating in. People that have the power of choice in our diets are not participating in. These are fisheries that are last resort, that might be traditional or artisanal, but have been put under great stress by international fishing that then creates a vacuum of resources for, say, West African fishermen that are fishing on 19-foot pirogues with hand lines. Like, they are not the problem. They're not. However, they might be fishing on an ecosystem that is severely depleted, not by their own doing. So it's sort of, do you say just overfishing is bad? Like, well, no, not if it's feeding somebody that otherwise wouldn't have a meal. So you get into these really thorny, complex conversations pretty quick. But to me, that suggests that the path forward is likely more successful when we participate in this system, when we drive our dollars towards the examples we want to see replicated, towards building economies of expectation that seafood must be and will be sustainable, to me is going to drive change through these other mechanisms a lot better than just removing ourselves from the paradigm.
Couldn't agree more. When it comes to buying farmed fish, is there anything that you look out for? Because, I know that there's some data suggesting that farmed fish, they have higher levels of certain environmental toxins. I think a few people, maybe even many people, are familiar with the notion that farmed salmon aren't even pink at the beginning. Like they don't necessarily have the color that we expect salmon to embody, and that coloring is added like after the fact, which there's different ways of now farming. Are some sorts of operations better than others, and what do you look out for when buying farmed fish?
So blanket, I will say domestically produced. Farmed seafood, of which we don't have a whole lot. We've got some shining examples of, but in terms of overall volume, we're just not there, and it's an incredible opportunity. And I'd love to maybe speak to that down the road in this conversation. Domestically produced, but look at country of origin. You were right to mention Norway, Scotland, Chile has made some advances, still has some hurdles to get over. But Canadian, et cetera, there are countries that have set up programs under which everyone must operate to this high standard. Beyond that country of origin, which requires some knowledge on the consumer's part, go towards those certifications, Aquaculture Stewardship Council or Best Aquaculture Practices, both certifications that carry through to the product, at the point of sale. But to be perfectly honest, I was very much an activist against farmed seafood at the outset. I was a bumper sticker having farmed and dangerous chef. If it was farmed and it wasn't an oyster, I didn't want it. I didn't think it should exist. But I had my mind changed, and when I began to realize that from a cost-benefit analysis, humanity actually really benefits in the end. Like, yes, there are some environmental, yes, there are things to figure out yet. A lot of them have been, we have made great progress towards just in the few decades that I've been involved in this. But bottom line is, from a cost-benefit analysis, we win with aquaculture. So what do I look for is those certifications. Again, going to a grocery store, retailer, or chef that you trust. But if I could pick up on another thread of what you're saying, so the coloring in salmon, for example, that is probably the best example of how the seafood industry is sort of self-defeating, in that seafood consumption in America has remained very static over the course of centuries. When the first data was available, I think is 1909. Americans ate 11 pounds of seafood per person per year. 7 pounds of that was oysters, which is crazy in some parts of the country. But we've risen as high as 18 pounds per person, but we're really stuck around 16 and a half, and it's been that way for decades now. As opposed to land animal proteins, which we eat more than 250 pounds per person per year. It'd be pork, chicken, lamb, veal, turkey, and rabbit, whatever. So the industry has sort of historically had a lot of infighting and a lot of cannibalism for business. I take your bit, I win your business by undercutting your current vendor. And when aquaculture came on the scene in real volume, it really threatened a lot of the existing sort of systems. And rightly so. It was a real threat. I mean, cod was having trouble, and that was America's whitefish, and now all of a sudden tilapia is on the market, and it's $4, actually like $1.79 a pound. Whole hell breaks loose, and codfish. I mean, it was disastrous. But the bottom line is, we ended up attacking each other, saying tilapia is terrible, and farmed salmon has color in it, and this and that. It's like, well, there's some truth to this, but they were all taken out of context. For example, the colorant in farmed salmon, all salmon are white, but for the diet that they eat, from which they bioaccumulate astaxanthin. It's the same reason why flamingos are pink. Some of the year, flamingos are white until they get into shrimp season, at which point they turn pink. Salmon, same thing. So instead of a wild, naturally occurring astaxanthin that colors wild fish, there is a lab-derived astaxanthin carotenoid that colors farm salmon. There is zero evidence that I have seen that it has any negative impact on health. Does it carry the same sort of gravity of health benefits that the natural astaxanthin does with its antioxidant properties? No, but there's certainly no detriment or negative impact to it. And the result of that color added label that's required, that was the result of a trade dispute between wild fishermen and farmed, trying to sort of vilify the farmed by saying color added. Yeah, well, color added to no ill effect, so why have it there? So it's created this sort of spawn of intrigue and sort of distrust of the seafood industry. And that's what I was saying earlier, that seafood is the only food that's considered guilty before proven innocent. It's like all the shit we have to wade through just to get to the point of like, yeah, salmon does sound good. Like, man, we're 40 minutes into this conversation. We haven't even gotten there yet,
Well, it's pretty funny. I personally supplement with astaxanthin myself. So in a way, I'm like a farmed salmon. But I do that for the health benefits. And so, logically, it wouldn't make sense for me to oppose the adding of astaxanthin to salmon, farmed salmon fish meal. For example, if I myself take it as a supplement, too. And I also really appreciate that, at the end of the day, wherever your fish comes from, it's still a relatively lean source, and the fats that fish do provide are very healthful fats. But generally, it's a very low calorie, high protein food that shouldn't be vilified. That shouldn't be feared, no matter where it comes from. At the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's sort of where I have landed. Is I consider myself a seafood evangelist. That it's my mission to get more people across all demographics eating more seafood, because I believe that through the pathways we have access to, we will create very positive public health outcomes. It will create positive economic outcomes, and ultimately, I think it will be a catalyst towards achieving very positive environmental outcomes. So it might seem a bit of a reversal to say, hey, I want sustainable oceans, let's eat more seafood. But I believe that's really what we have available to us. I started off saying that I'm going to fix seafood, and now I really see that seafood's a means to fix people. And
yeah,
we still have to be careful where it comes from. But
of course, how can people add more seafood to their diet? Is it just adding more of the big, like the most popular fish, more salmon, more tuna, or are there other species out there that you think people ought to be integrating that they're currently not?
This is a question of access. I want people eating more seafood in America. Of the 17, 18 pounds we eat per person per year, 95% of that comes from only 10 species. We are extremely trepidatious of diversity in this country. Wow, that statement could be used in a number of different conversations, couldn't it? 65% of our total consumption of seafood in this country is from shrimp, canned salmon, canned tuna, and salmon alone. And if you throw in basically all the rest of the fish are all flaky white fish. They're forms of catfish, cod, and and then some clams. But other than that, there's thousands of species out there. Do we have access to them all? No, not unless you have access to coastal markets or specialty markets, or can afford to put a fish on an airplane, ordered online, which I have some issues against. So by all means, if diversity is available to you, diversity is the cornerstone of sustainability for everything, from your stock portfolio to our society, to your diet, et cetera. So eat diversely from the oceans. Is that feasible for everybody? No. But one of the things that I love so much about the seafood messaging is that people might think it's elitist. It's like, actually take me to any gas station in America and the only sustainable food you're going to find is the canned fish. It's also the healthiest thing there. And whether it's canned jack mackerel for 99 cents or can of tuna or can of sardines, well, congratulations, because you actually found the healthiest of the healthy seafood. Good quality seafood is available to everybody in this country, everywhere. And that includes, and ever more so, the freezer aisle, which I believe is the future of the seafood industry.
Frozen seafood.
Yeah. You heard it here first. Chef saying frozen seafood is the way to go.
Would that be considered blasphemy among more traditional chefs, or what?
Certainly. There is a well-deserved legacy bias that is very powerful around frozen seafood because it sucked. I mean, it was bad, man. Like, seafood was frozen in the back of the Kenmore on Saturday morning after it hadn't sold on Friday to the faithful few. It was like, it was a means. Freezing seafood used to be a means of a last-ditch effort to stop that last step towards spoiled. But now seafood is frozen oftentimes at or very close to the point of capture or the point of processing. I've actually complained to some seafood processors that their fish was too fresh when they froze it, that it hadn't gone through rigor and developed any flavor. And they just looked at me. They're like, "You chefs, man, you were such a pain in the ass." But super deep freeze technology that's using temperatures -80 degrees, micro misting of water all this technological stuff that yields fillets that have been arrested in their pristine condition, to the point where if you look at fresh as a measure of bacterial growth, you cannot get fresher than this. Am I saying that fresh seafood isn't good? No, absolutely not. I mean, there will always be a place for that. But bottom line is there are environmental benefits to frozen seafood. It can travel at much slower speeds, greatly reduces waste throughout the system. It also allows for seasonal abundance to be taken advantage of and then parsed out throughout the year, rather than say, hey, scallop season's open for a month. Come and get it, folks. And, fishermen sell into a market at whatever they can get. It's like, well, if they can actually freeze them well and then sell them at a premium for 12 months, that's a very different economy. You're sustaining a lot more people with the same number of scallops from an economic standpoint. So there are all these benefits that sort of trickle back or actually just roll back through the system. And at the end of the day, is it delicious? Yeah, it is. And is it cheaper? Yeah. And does seafood now become a convenience food that it's Tuesday? I'm sorry, can I cuss on your show?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, cool. Tuesday night, and I got to make dinner, and the toddler's screaming, and the baby's having, a tooth come in, and oh my God, I'm just going to throw a piece of salmon in the toaster oven at 275 degrees. I'm going to forget about it. And 35 minutes later, it's going to be perfect. For those of you not watching, I'm patting myself on the back right now because, yeah, it's that easy. And it was an epically good dish.
I have at my last home, I just moved, actually. I was in Venice for a while, and a couple blocks from my old house was a 99-cent store. And I walked into the 99-cent store just to see what was available. Now, granted, I know that this happens to be a 99-cent store in Los Angeles, so it's a very privileged market. But I was pretty shocked to see frozen, I believe it was even wild fish in the freezer section in the 99-cent store. And of course, there was a bounty of canned options as well. So I think you're right. I think that people really do need to open their eyes to the fact that this is a very accessible form of food, a sustainable form of type of food, and a way for people to have access to seafood that might not necessarily be, have that coastal access that you and I are so lucky to have.
As I said, I can see the fishing boats and go clamming on my own property here and pick mussels from the rocks. And yet we eat probably 3 to 4 meals a week of canned seafood, simply because of the economics and convenience of it. And I know I'm feeding my kids like really good, healthful food, and it's an honor and a blessing to be able to do that.
Do you make any concessions for, you mentioned methyl mercury content in seafood. How much does that play into your dietary choices?
As a 42-year-old male, it is not a concern. Just looking at me from a sort of a population statistic, methyl mercury is not a concern for me. Basically, it is a bigger concern. A lack of omega-3s in my diet would be a bigger concern than methyl mercury. That said, methyl mercury is incredibly important for certain populations to pay attention to. Mm-hmm. And we should all have it in our minds. But the bottom line is that contaminant issue has cast a pall over the entire category. Whereas with methyl mercury, if you look at a cost-benefit analysis of the benefits brought by the clean lean protein and mostly the omega-3 content versus the costs associated with methyl mercury contamination or PCBs, there are very few fish that actually fall under that curve. And you're talking about sharks, marlins, king mackerels, and tilefish. Now, some of you listening might have that on your menu tonight, but the vast majority of us might never have that, or even be faced with the decision of like, should I have the marlin or the king mackerel tonight? And this is, I am not trivializing the importance of this. Methyl mercury can be found in fish that are very commonly available, especially in sushi, tuna, etc. Some sushi tunas. But the bottom line is, in America, we have an epidemic of a lack of omega-3s in our diet. And if you look at some of the incredible science done by Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, Eric Rim, et cetera, colleagues of mine when I was at Harvard, if we were to eat what our own government recommends, 2 servings per week of seafood rich in omega-3s, we reduce cardiac mortality incidence by 36%. Whoa! That's a moral issue to me that we be talking about seafood consumption. Overall reduction in mortality incidence by 17%, reduction in Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. You also have brain development, neurogeneration from young. You have help with diabetes, with depression. Just why are we not talking about seafood as a solution to fix people? And that's sort of where I've gotten to with. And unfortunately, that mercury concern, that PCB concern, I think has overshadowed or has become a specter that taints what is the vast majority of this category, which is this incredible healthful food.
Couldn't agree more. As far as I know, there's even been some rethinking, and I don't know how deep a dive you've done into the selenium to mercury ratio in fish as being, important when it comes to one's risk for mercury poisoning from seafood. So obviously, mercury, occupational exposure to mercury is very dangerous. But my understanding is that there's a rethinking in terms of how potentially dangerous mercury from fish actually is. That as long as the fish has more, because one of the major, if not sole, probably not sole, but one of the major mechanisms by which mercury is neurotoxic is that it binds to selenoproteins in the brain, like selenium-based antioxidants in the brain, thus incapacitating them. But if fish has more selenium than mercury, then there's essentially a canceling out effect that occurs. And so some of the earliest studies, if I recall correctly, so I wrote about this in my second book, but some of the earliest studies that showed seafood consumption related to mercury poisoning, actually people weren't consuming fish. They were consuming like the pilot whale, which has very high mercury levels, particularly relative to its selenium content. So I don't know if any of that is familiar to you, if you could speak to that. Or
I don't have, I've not looked into the literature on that.
Yeah.
To the extent to talk about it from any expertise. And I am, I am not a health expert. I've hung around the giants of the field enough to know what I'm talking about, but I'm not in a position to give specific advice. But I think generally, whether or not the selenium sort of block is there, or whether that ratio sort of pans out, the important takeaway message is that seafood is safe. Seafood is healthy. Seafood is an essential part of the diet of healthful people, of a healthy diet for some people. So, yeah, I think we get lost, lost in those sort of semantics a little bit sometimes, and we forget to just stay at the seafood case and say seafood is what's for dinner. But I will look into that because it is fascinating.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Well, we don't have a lot of time left. Is there anything that you'd like to add before we close? I mean, this is such an important conversation. And I feel like, the conversation is so important that limiting it to an hour almost does it a disservice. But you've already dropped such incredible knowledge for my audience. And I'm sure, many of my listeners are going to want to seek you out on social media and watch all of your content online. But is there anything that you'd like to add that perhaps I didn't ask you about this crucial topic?
Well, thanks for having me on and for the kind words there. I think I would ask people to reconsider aquaculture, even those with a neutral vantage point on it, or anyone with a bias. Those biases are real. They're based on facts and based on historical precedent from the industry. But bottom line is that industry is evolving at such a rapid clip. It is so exciting. It is so essential and so capable of answering for so many issues, from women's empowerment and employment in developing nations to just the health crises that we face in our own diets, to economic opportunity for coastal rural economies here in America. And just generally, hey, how are we going to feed this planet? And well, a good thing to look at is maybe 70% of the planet, or 99% of its livable space that happens to be underwater. That idea that we see the oceans as beautiful for our absence, I think needs to be reconsidered broadly from a cultural perspective, to say that, wow, we can do this right. Wow, we have a future on the ocean. And whether or not it's relevant to you, the listener, in your own life, no, but it is relevant to you in a macro sense, that this is a major next step for the human experience and for us maintaining our reality, and I think even improving our reality. So I would just beg you to urge you to consider aquaculture anew, and to maybe see it with some enthusiasm for the good that it can bring to us, as part of and partner to wild fisheries that must sustain and must endure, and provide us with access to America's first heritage food.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
The research shows several things. One is certainly increased toxicity in the environment. So everything from, the nutrient density and quality of food that kids are eating or not eating, to things like air quality and pollution, all of those things, chemicals that kids are exposed to in utero, as well as, during their childhood. So we know those are factors.